Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Parallax Spiritual Book Club, a weekly online platform where we read and explore different texts from the hidden wisdom traditions. You can find us here every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Paris time on Zoom. For more information, check out the links in the description below. I had the great pleasure to have a conversation this Sunday with Dr. Marc Gafni, who is the president of the Center for Integral Wisdom. I think it's important to say here that Marc is a controversial character. The reason I chose to invite him is that he comes highly recommended by spiritually intelligent and critical people who I love and trust. Public figures like Ken Wilber, Sally Kempton, Zach Stein, and others have stuck with Marc through his controversies, while others have tried to take him out. I don't know what happened, but it happened in the last century, as far as I can tell. And Marc strikes me as a guy with something important to say. Also, I thoroughly enjoyed his ecstatic presence in this conversation. Since I'm just getting to know Marc, and the beginning of this conversation was tragically lost, I asked Marc's colleague Krista what I should say for an intro, and she sent me the following text. Dr. Marc Gafni is the president of the Center for Integral Wisdom. He is an epic figure who, after decades of work, is now coming into focus. Marc is articulating what he and his colleagues at the Center for Integral Wisdom call an evolution of the very source code of consciousness and culture, telling a new story of meaning, integrating the best of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern thought into a new vision or worldview, which he calls, together with Zach Stein and Barbara Marx Hubbard, cosmo-erotic humanism. Integrating multiple meta-theories into a larger vision, Marc and Zach explain cosmo-erotic humanism as a new set of what they are calling evolving first principles and first values, rooted in a story of value. The goal is to evoke a new human and a new humanity, and what they call the fulfillment of Homo sapiens in Homo amor. Marc is what some have called a prophetic figure, who both embodies Eros, activates great love, partnership, and support, and like most figures of his kind, has also suffered the attempt at the murder of Eros. Dozens of people who work with him daily describe his kindness, integrity, and goodness behind the scenes to be exactly as it shows up in the public, which itself is how I experience him every day. That's his colleague, Krista. So enjoy this conversation.
Let me perhaps start with if we can, Andrew, kind of step back and set up kind of a general set of questions and then go to Eros. Is that fair?
Sure.
Because we can't actually enter Eros without a broader context. And of course, the most important thing I just want to say that people missed in the pre-recording part that we didn't mention is that I complimented Andrew's glasses. So I want to make sure to get that on the recording. We got that. Okay. So here we go.
You're looking very fine yourself.
There we go. All right. Now we got some Eros moving. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's find what we might call the meta crisis, right? Because the context for the conversation around Eros has to be the meta crisis. It's not a theoretical or a meta-theoretical conversation. It's actually a conversation which is, I think, the overwhelming, moral imperative of this moment in time. So if we would look at the meta crisis, right? And by meta crisis, I mean, borrowing Nick Bostrom's term and, the early 2000s existential risk, right? And Nick's done, a very, very good job of unpacking what existential risk means. And he has a 2019, essay, which is quite good, called The Vulnerability Hypothesis, where he kind of unpacks, existential risk as a black ball that comes out of an urn. And that black ball is, a set of exponential technologies that don't require, like an atomic bomb, a nation state to enact them. They don't require enriched uranium. It can't be monitored, by public actors, non-state actors playing, right, in which you can easily enact a weaponized technology, right, which exponentially gets more and more dangerous, and deliver it into, for example, the heart of the world system and bring the world system down. That's one of about 15 existential risks. Nick is a student of Derek Parfit, right, in Oxford. Derek did some really, really important work on moral realism and really brought existential risk front and center, right? One of Nick's colleagues, Toby Ord, wrote a book on existential risk, which is a good summation in 2020. So that's the topic. Let's kind of take that as a broad background. And I would imagine that most people come to this conversation have a sense of that background. So
I'm feeling Wilhelm Reich here when you're speaking about existential risk and how he would talk about the repression of Eros leading directly to totalitarianism.
Yes, that is actually a brilliant right intuition, Andrew. In other words, Reich had the sense in mass psychology and fascism, right? Reich had the sense that there's this interlinking between the flow of Eros, right, in culture and in an individual, and right the experience of breakdown of culture. And for him, he didn't know existential risk. He knew, but he knew totalitarianism. Existential risk, of the nature that we know now wasn't available then. It was more of a nuclear threat. But he completely understood the need to reclaim Eros. His understanding of Eros was more primitive, right? He was dissociated from the great traditions. He wasn't integrating pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, but his intuition was unbelievably important. And of course, Andrew, he died in 1957 in a prison in Kentucky, right? In other words, so talk about the murder of Eros, right? Wilhelm Reich lived a tragic life, was wildly pilloried, right? Attacked and hated and beloved, right? And so, he actually expressed that moment in culture. So putting Reich on the table at the outset, it's a great notion.
And the murder of Eros too, that should be really put on the table. I think that the Christian symbolism is entirely about that as well, and so much of this religious symbolism that we have, right?
And the Christian symbolism, which is the crucifixion, right, is of course the murder of God, right, which is the murder of Eros. Actually, in the book Return to Eros, which is at least our official topic, right, there's a small essay in the end called The Murder of Eros, which is maybe, an essay called The Murder of Eros and an essay called The Pain of Eros, which are actually wildly important, and they're short. And, so I if I can, just, gently recommend them to anyone. So let's go back now to existential risk as we understand it in this moment. Okay. So what are the generator functions for existential risk? And myself and Barbara Marx Hubbard and my friend Daniel and a host of other, thinkers have come to a similar set of conclusions, which is that the generator function for existential risk is, on the one hand, in what Barbara always called win-lose metrics, right? That is to say, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. I call it the success story. We actually hosted a success summit in 2014, right, to address the success story. Actually, Daniel was there, right, which was about the failed story at the center of culture, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. That's one generator function. But that generates what David Snowden called not complex systems, but complicated systems, right? Complicated systems in which there's dissociation between the parts. So those are the two generator functions, but that's not where I want to go. With your permission, Andrew, actually, those are not the root cause. And I think it's a mistake, right, to identify those as the root cause. And this will take us kind of the heart of the matter. The actually underlying the generator functions, there's a root cause, and I want to call the root cause a global intimacy disorder. A global intimacy disorder. Now, a global intimacy disorder means, right, to actually address that, we need, and here we're going to, with permission, Andrew, we're going to jump 5 years ahead of Return to Eros, because what I'm about to say is not in Return to Eros, but let's jump 5 years ahead what myself and Zach and we're thinking about now. Let's define intimacy, right? Because if we can define intimacy, right, then the statement that we live in an intimate universe will make sense. And the second statement, the intimate universe lives in us. Those two statements are corollary generator functions for a new society that can respond to existential risk. So let me offer a definition of intimacy. And if I can, I don't know, maybe this is, I apologize in Europe if what I'm about to do is too American, right? I'm particularly Israeli, but, if anyone in the chat box wants to just write it, because just to catch it, you're of course welcome to. So, and this is an actual equation of the interior sciences. Right. So here's the equation. And it took, 10 years to say the simple equation, but it's very helpful. So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of bracket relative and bracket, in the context of relative otherness, So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of relative otherness times, I actually started writing it as plus, Daniel suggested making it times, which is a good idea, times mutuality of recognition, times mutuality of pathos, we can feel each other, times mutuality of value, times mutuality of purpose. So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of relative otherness times mutuality of recognition, times mutuality of pathos, times mutuality of value, times mutuality of purpose. Now, here's the wild thing, Andrew. That equation it's as fundamental as E equals MC squared, but it's a fundamental equation of the interior sciences, but it doesn't do mathematical values, right? It does interior values, first principles and first values, right? Another new term that didn't make it into Return to Eros, and it applies everywhere. In other words, whether I'm a lepton, hadron, proton, right? I'm a proton, let's say, and a neutron and an electron coming together, allured to each other to create an atom, which means, right, we come together and create a shared identity in the context of otherness, because there's still protons, neutrons, and electrons, and we have a mutuality of recognition, right? I can do a lot of the science on it, but we'll skip it for now. But the subatomic particles actually recognize each other. They feel each other. There's an actual felt field, that there's a shared field of value, and there's shared function purpose. So it applies, right, to a couple. It applies to subatomic particles. It applies to an organization, right? It applies to divisions within a government. It applies to self, right? To be intimate with myself is to have shared identity with all of my split off parts, all of my split off voices, right? And so we actually now have an intimacy formula, which actually governs the structure of cosmos. Now, let's go back to existential risk, and then we'll finish this first kind of riff and pass it back to you. And thank you for your patience, right? So a global intimacy disorder means there's a breakdown in shared identity. So for example, multipolar traps. Why are there multipolar traps? And multipolar traps, which my friend, Dee, right, and many other people have talked a lot about, the tragedy of the commons, that someone's going to develop an exponential technology and generate it because there's no transparency, because there's no intergovernmental transparency, and therefore the race to the bottom, we have to produce it. Well, that's because I believe that I have a discrete identity as a corporation, as a group, as a nation, right, as some sort of communion that actually can survive existential risk. In other words, it's a failure of intimacy. The notion of a multipolar trap means there's no shared identity, right? There's no mutuality of recognition. There's no shared feeling, right? Feeling, you feel me, I feel you. You feel me feeling you, I feel you feeling me. There's no mutuality of pathos. There's no mutuality of value. There's no mutuality of purpose. So that's the global intimacy disorder. Last sentence. The way we solve the intimacy disorder is through a shared story.
A shared story.
Now, when I say shared story, I mean a shared story of value rooted in first principles and first values. And whether I'm doing marriage counseling, right, which I do, some of, right, and you realize, oh, wow, there's no shared story. Until we can get a shared story on the table of how the marriage went and a shared story about reality based on shared first principles and first values, everything else, you're just patching things up, it collapses. And so having a shared story of value rooted in first principles and first values, that's what generates intimacy. Right now, often, in pre-modernity, you had fictive stories, or you had fictions, or that's what postmodernity and what Foucault understood. But actually, we actually can generate, based on first principles and first values, a universal grammar of value rooted in a shared story that heals the global intimacy disorder. So I would say all the work we're doing in Eros, and all the work we're doing in unique self, and all the work we're doing in first principles and first values is in this context, right? In other words, there's an overwhelming moral imperative to speak for the unborn generations, for the trillions of unborn people who won't be born. Right? And we can only do that by getting underneath the generator functions. The generator functions are infrastructure, but the superstructure, Manfred Harris's term, the superstructure is global intimacy disorder, which means no shared story rooted in first principles and first values. So that's a big mouthful. Thank you super much for the patience. But now we have that on the table. Now we have a context. Now we have a framework.
Yeah.
Fair?
There's a lot of ways, I could go here. I guess what I'm thinking of, and what I've been thinking of as you're speaking, is that the existential crisis is an interior one and an exterior one.
Yes.
like we're broken inside and can't experience intimacy. And that is the meaning crisis or whatever. And then the exterior one is that just reflects outward more and more. So
Yeah.
what I'm wondering is in terms of your emphasis on sexuality, on what is sex and Eros relationship to intimacy? I mean, why is there this emphasis on sex, particularly in your work?
Right. So I would say one thing. The emphasis in my work is on Eros. So I want to be, in other words, you're I think reading Return to Eros, and you were very sweet to write a note into that little group thread when I think you were 30 pages in, which I super appreciated. Mm-hmm. If you notice, and let me try and say it this way. There were 12 billion years of Eros before sex, right?
Before sex.
Right? And 12 billion years of Eros before there's any sex, which is really important to understand. And Reich, right? Although Reich understood Eros, he focused, strongly on sexuality, but he wasn't wrong entirely. He was actually largely right? Why? So what happens is you've got these 12 billion years of Eros, and Eros is, and let's just offer another equation. Here's a second equation. And this is, again, an interior science equation. And you get a sense this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get out of the generalized conversation, which is very abstract and very, very non-rigorous, and try and create new equations. Here's an equation. Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, seeking, moving towards, desiring, ever deeper contact, and ever greater wholeness. That's an Eros equation. The second part of the equation that we often bracket, which yields in its wake ever greater depth, creativity, and transformation. And these two equations, by the way, are the core of what Zach and I are calling cosmoerotic humanism. Those are two core equations. Now, what's the relationship, says Andrew, of that to sex? So let's say it this way. You could be having sex all the time and be completely non-erotic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or you could be celibate and you could be erotic, right? Or you could be monogamous and fully erotic or non-erotic, right? So it's all about sex, and it's not about sex at all. And here's the simple equation, which is the sexual models the erotic. It doesn't exhaust the erotic, right? And this is unbelievably important, right? Because every single person on this call has an experience of sexuality. And every person on this call has had pain, right? Some level of rejection, some level of even trauma, some level of joy and ecstasy and vision and delight, either in enacted sexuality or a vision of what might be. And that lives anthro-ontologically. That's another key term in cosmoerotic humanism. Human being ontologically, ontology lives in me. And we're developing what we call the anthro-ontological method. But anthro-ontologically, that lives in every one of us in the call. Now, you can't escape your relationship to desire. And if I can, with permission, Andrew, let me shift terms from sex, which, like God, is a complicated term. Let's talk about desire. I would say desire is at the center, right, of our conversation on Eros. And there's a cluster of words, a word cluster, which I discuss in Radical Kabbalah, the usage of word clusters that are not denotative, they're connotative. Mm-hmm. Right? And we were talking about last night, Gödel and Tarski's, incompleteness theorem, which says that value equations, right? You don't have a complete value, say you're always moving towards infinity. So that's true not only about the exterior sciences and mathematics. It's not only true about physics today, it's also true in the interior sciences, meaning there is value, but that value is evolving value. So we're not making a regressive claim about value. That's an unbelievably important conversation that we can have later, but there's what we're calling an evolving perennialism. There's evolving value. So Eros, desire, and intimacy are a word cluster of values in cosmos that are evolving. Now, desire is at the root of sexuality, right? Mm-hmm. Now, we don't have, right, a story about our own experience of desire. And in every single person's experiencing desire, and yet there's this dissonance because we don't have a narrative of desire that's equal to our experience of desire.
So that's the need for mythos to add to the pathos.
I think mythos is an ill-defined word which is used by so many people in so many different ways. So I wouldn't say mythos. I would actually, with permission, I would stick with the word value, right? In other words, desire is a value of cosmos, and we need not mythos so much, right?
But value is a story, like your story about what's important. Is that what you mean by
a story means I live inside of a narrative frame.
Yeah.
Right. We live, right? Charles Taylor, right? We live in inescapable frameworks, right? Or Manfred Harris. I live inside of not just a social structure and an infrastructure. I live in a superstructure. And that superstructure is the story in which I live. And again, it's not enough to have first values and first principles. You need first values and first principles, and this is a whole conversation by itself. You need first values and first principles rooted in a story of value. We think in stories, and in Kabbalah, right? The Hasidic masters say in versions of Aramaic and Hebrew, God loves stories. But what they mean is that there's an ontology to story, right? In other words, the story of Andrew's life is not just, as Buddha suggested, that to be moved beyond, right, in order to realize his true self. No, actually, there's a separate self story of Andrew. So there might be some stuff that we might want to liberate from there. There might be some recurrent loops and recursive patterns. Then Andrew becomes true self, right? He's one with the field, but that field is not a field just of awareness, Buddhist mistake. It's a field of consciousness and desire. And then that field individuates as Andrew Sweeney, which is his unique self. And his unique self has a storyline. It has plot lines, and those plot lines are intrinsically valuable. They matter. And one of those plot lines is desire. And it's not just desire, which is sexual, as Buddha said in the original Pali Canon, have few desires, but have great ones. But it's my desire today to talk to Andrew, right? Right. I have this desire. Wow, I'm excited to talk to Andrew today, right? I'm excited to have this call. That's a desire.
Since I'm involved in tantric Buddhism to a certain extent, I see that in two ways. I see that the sutric path, is all about getting a handle on desire. And then the tantric path is all about expressiveness.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's go to sexuality. I don't want to duck the question. I want just to create a larger frame for it because it's a fair question. So we need a new sexual narrative, right? And tantric Buddhism almost gets there. For lots of reasons it gets stuck. We could do a very deep conversation, separate dialogue on Tantric Buddhism and how it plays with the other Buddhist schools. That's a great conversation, but let's go and let's create meta-theoretical frame. So what's our sexual narrative today? So we know that we've got, the old sexual narrative, sex negative. And that certainly has some truth to it. Sex can definitely get us in trouble. Sex can definitely be dangerous. Well, we all know that's true. That's for sure. And so they weren't entirely wrong. And by the way, what's great about the sex negative narrative is they took sex seriously, right? And there's a gravitas to the sexual, right? It was a worthy adversary, right? Then we moved to, that's pre-modernity. We moved to modernity to kind of either sex neutral Kinsey, right? Just like having lunch, but who thinks it's just like having lunch? That doesn't actually work anthropologically. Sex positive, which is much more dominant culture, but positive is way too bland a word to capture the experience of sexuality. Sex sacred because it creates babies, right? But when was the last time most people on this podcast had sex to create a baby? Which means the four narratives we have about sexuality don't meet our experience of sexuality, and sexuality turns us upside down, right? We have hidden desires. We have dark desires, right? We have desires that are larger than social conventions, and we're pathologized for them. And we need to mythologize, not pathologize, meaning we need to enact, right, a new sexual narrative in which we keep every boundary that should be kept. Full ethics, full ethos, full integrity. That's a given. But we actually have a different experience of our sexuality. And let's call that, if we can, sex erotic. And sex erotic means that I live in a cosmoerotic universe, and the cosmoerotic universe lives in me. So the sexual impulse that arises in me, or the desire that arises in me, is never local. There's no local desire. It's the field of desire. It's the Eros that initiates cosmos itself, right? That animates the evolutionary impulse. That's loving reality open in every second. That is both the love and fuck of cosmos. Right? Not just love. It's not just tender. It's the fuck of cosmos, right? Reality is love, and it's Eros, and it's got a quality of fuck. And we use the word fuck because it captures a dimension of reality that actually is powerful, right? And I finished writing an essay, a 20,000 word essay on tracing that word, right? And why that word kind of, it needs to be engaged, because when we bypass that word and its energy, we create abuse.
Yeah.
So sex.
Is that because sex has a tender aspect, but it also has a violent, dark aspect as well?
Well, I would.
It potentially, at least, or at least there's a destructive quality to existence as well as a creative one at the same time.
So there is Eros and Thanatos, but I think in sexuality, it's not Eros and Thanatos. I think there's a quivering tenderness in sexuality, which is beautiful. And there's a fierce rawness in sexuality, but I wouldn't reduce the fierce rawness to a destructive violence. That would be the shadow expression of the fierce rawness. And again, this is where we go. And this is very important. And we actually aren't willing to claim the fierce rawness and all of its audacity and all of its beauty, right? And we actually identify it with its shadow expression, right? Actually, there's a quivering tenderness and there's a fierce rawness, and they're both sacred and they're both qualities of she, right? They're both qualities, in Kashmir Shaivism and Kabbalah, right? Of this quality of she, which is both fierce and doesn't destroy for its own sake, but destroys all that which is superficial, cuts through all that which is surface. That's what Kali does. Kali is a mad lover, right? As is in Kabbalah, the Shekhinah Nora'ah. It's called the terrible Shekhinah, but it's not Thanatos, right? Freud misappropriated it as a form of Thanatos, different conversation. So the sexual, right? If I can actually get the sense that actually the sexual movement in me, the desire that moves in me, is part of the field of Eros, the infinite field of Eros. And for the first time, Andrew, I can move beyond shame. And shame is when Eros stops short of infinity.
Maybe shame is Thanatos in a way.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful, right? Wow, just got excited. That's beautiful, right? Right? Shame is absolutely, and shame is not the appropriate shame. Shame, let's be tantric for a second in order to talk about shame. So in Tantra, there's basically, if I had to sum up all world Tantra, and I mean this carefully, not glibly or superficially, I would say Tantra has three principles. Right. And when I say Tantra, I don't mean only Buddhist Tantra or only Kashmir Shaivite Tantra. I mean the tantric layer that runs through world religions. There's a Kabbalistic Tantra as well. There's a Sufi Tantra. I'd say Tantra is one, the principle of non-rejection. Nothing's off the table. There's a principle of non-rejection.
Yeah.
Two, trace every phenomenon and experience, personal, collective, back to its source. Trace it always back to its source. Two. And three, reality is a trickster, right? It's not as it seems, right? It's not as it seems. And if I'd add
wisdom aspect,
yes, reality is a trickster. So when we talk about shame, we have to be careful not to shame, right?
Yes.
Right. So there's a place for shame. Reality is a trickster, but for the time being, let's actually engage the first level. Shame is not the experience that I made a mistake. Shame is the experience that not that I did something wrong, but that I am wrong.
Yeah.
That's the experience of shame, right? That actually I'm broken, that actually I'm missing a part and the factory's not manufacturing it anymore and there's no place to get it. And from that perspective, one of the great trauma therapists in this generation, Lori Galperin, right, made this point, and she's in our group of scholars and working with myself and the whole gang, right, with Zach and Claire and Dr. Kincaid and the whole gang, right? Ken, right. Lori has the statement, which I want to attribute to her because it's a great joy to attribute something to someone, right? Is shame is the root of all evil, right? And what she means is, right? She means something of what you're saying. Shame is the root of Thanatos, and we live in a planet drenched in shame. We live in a planet drenched in shame, right? And shame is the fundamental experience, and shame adheres to sexuality. Right? Shame adheres to sexuality. Now, how do I heal shame? So that's a big conversation. I just had the privilege with Christina of finishing a phenomenology of Eros, which is, for better or worse, 14 volumes. And there's one volume on shame. So we're not going to try and cover the volume, but let's just say one thing, right? I can begin to heal shame by actually telling a new story of desire. In other words, if I actually can begin to experience my desire, my clarified desire, right, as an expression of the field of desire, actually that the Eros of cosmos is moving through me, right? Then actually that experience becomes not pathological, right? It's not the way in Me Too, right? There were a number of Times op-eds about the inherent brutality of masculine. It's not demonized masculine desire. It's not split off feminine desire, as Laura Kipnis, the feminist theorist, points out. No one in the entire Me Too movement ever wanted to have sex, right? Laura Kipnis's point and Katrina Hoff-Sommer's point, right? And, Daphne Patai's point, great feminine theorists, that actually we've split off feminine desire and we've demonized masculine desire because we don't have a narrative of desire. And I must have read, Andrew, 1,000 articles we tracked on Me Too. There was not one article that had anything articulate about a narrative of desire. Here we are talking about sexuality and about inappropriate, utterly wrong, zero tolerance for male sexual harassment.
So
no narrative of desire.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Why is this happening? Why is it just because sexuality is the most intimate and terrifying place there is, and beautiful and all of those things? Because there's a lot of sex around, right? I mean, people are having all kinds of sex, but
yeah.
But I guess this intimacy thing that you're talking about is
go back to the sex. So you're absolutely right. So you point out, right, and in some sense you're echoing very beautifully Rollo May, if you remember, right, his book Love and Will, right, and he says so much sex, and Love and Will is one of the great. It was Rollo May's best contribution, but basically so much sex and so little pleasure, right? So much sex. Right, we have varieties of sexuality.
Sort of this mechanical fucking like porn, endless porn.
Right. Can you imagine in the 16th century, Andrew? Right, if someone told you that there's a box, right? You play with you press in some things on the box, and then thousands of men and women appear. Then you have a little plastic card. And if you put the plastic card in, you can talk to them. Yeah. You can tell them to have sex with each other and how to have sex with each other. Yeah. And you'll be able to watch them in close-up zoom. You're in the 16th century, right? The greatest sultan of Turkey with his harem, right, couldn't dream of this possibility, right? So we live in a sexual universe which is unimaginable, right? All of sexuality has changed in the virtual world, different conversation, critically important conversation. But the point is, right, and we're Tindering, right? Tinder is no longer Tinder.
I was thinking of that, yeah.
Right, we're swiping left, right on Tinder, right? So you've got full availability. And we thought, oh, this was sexual liberation. But actually, sexuality collapsed. The liberation never happened because there's a complete collapse of frameworks.
Is that the lack of a story, a lack of a narrative?
The lack of a story. Exactly.
Like the fact that the sexuality is an art form, not just a drive.
It's an art form, which is an expression, your narrative of desire, right? The art form, as you say it, it's not a skill, it's an art. But that art form is rooted in a story of desire. And your narrative of desire is rooted in your narrative of identity. Your narrative of identity is rooted in your universe story. So in other words, you can't have a narrative of desire unless you have a narrative of identity. And you can't have a narrative of identity, either the I or the we, unless you have a universe story. So if we have a reductionist, materialist universe story, right, or a scientistic universe story, or a creationist universe story, both of those universe stories are failed universe stories. So we need actually, not creationism, not scientism, we need a kind of new universe story. We call that cosmoerotic humanism. That's what we need, right? And in a certain sense, cosmoerotic humanism, Andrew, is kind of it integrates integral theory. It integrates, 10 or 11 other meta theories into a larger, it's more like romanticism or existentialism. It's a larger movement, right, of cosmoerotic humanism, and implicit in it is a new universe story. So what would the new universe story be? It would be reality is desire. Reality is Eros, right? Evolution is not just simplicity to complexity. Evolution is the progressive deepening of intimacies. Who am I? Now, narrative of identity. I'm a unique configuration of Eros. I'm a unique configuration of intimacy. I'm a unique configuration of desire, narrative of identity, right? And now I have a narrative of desire, right? And so the desire that lives in me is not pathological, right? Although it may have pathological expressions. I may need to do therapeutic work to kind of work on split off parts. There may be, voices, there may be traumas. That's all legitimate. And Sam Harris, a week ago, sent me a script where someone talked about a sexual trauma, and he said, your self's not real anyways. right? So just realize yourself's not real. That's absurd, right? Right? That's a tragedy. It's a tragic expression of a kind of neo-Buddhism, which merges with materialism, which kind of defines Sam's work and define Derek Parfit's work, which is where Sam's rooting himself, and he's rooting himself in Derek Parfit. That's source for Sam, essentially. But we're not. No. Actually, there's a universe story, right? It's a cosmoerotic universe. Reality is Eros. It's an evolving Eros, right? I'm a unique configuration of Eros, right? That's what it means to be an irreducible, unique self. And now I've got a narrative of desire. Now that I have a narrative of desire, now we can begin a conversation. Now we can move beyond shame. All of this, Andrew, is completely missing in the conversation. Just missing. And then we wonder why there's a fundamental collapse and why we move towards, to answer your question, to a sexual puritanism. What's essentially happening now is there's a new sexual puritanism, which is at the center of the woke community, because on the one hand, we've said everything's permitted. Yeah. Right? Dostoevsky, right? Everything's permitted. On the other hand, there's no framework.
Yeah. Yeah. So everything's permitted, but everybody's policed at the same time.
Right. When everything's permitted and there's a collapse of frameworks, then everything's permitted translates into a sexual puritanism, which becomes a sexual fascism in which everyone's policed. Right. And what happens is, I mean, it's funny. There's a very, very good professor at Yale, Schultz, who did really, really important work on sexual harassment. And she points out, she does the history in legal cases of sexual harassment. And what she points out is that the issue began as a harassment issue. Right. And Catherine McKinnon, importantly and brilliantly, and Andrea Dworkin and Susan Brownmeller, who were all colleagues of actually Sally Kempton, who was an important second wave feminist, said, wow, right, there's harassment in the workplace and no one's even named it. And we did this very important step of naming the horror of sexual harassment. Why could you possibly have the right to touch a woman sexually because she's your secretary and pat her on the posterior? That's outrageous. That's an ethical violation of the highest order. So we named that. That was beautiful. That was an evolution of consciousness, an evolution of love. We named sexual harassment. But then, right, this is what Schultz points out, Vicky Schultz, right? She points out that what then gradually happened is the issue became not harassment in its sexual guise. The issue became sex, right? Meaning she points out in legal case after legal case, if sex was involved, it was per se problematized, right? So when there were massive harassment issues without sexuality, people would get off. But if there was this minor, right, tinge of sexuality, it's like, oh my God, sex is at play. There's a problem. Whoa, that's problematic. We're now demonizing sexuality, and meaning we're reverting. Our public narrative is sex sacred. We're having babies, sex neutral, Kinsey, sex positive. But really, the sex negative narrative is actually coming back to the fore. It's actually a new Puritanism in the new Church of Woke, right? Yeah. And that is unbelievably dangerous.
It's sort of like the Victorian age, which had the most pornography of any other age and the most Puritanism. Yeah.
Right. And in each of these things is a conversation, pornography itself. It's an important conversation, not our topic today. But the question is there room for public erotica? That's the deeper question. Yeah. Right. And there's this yearning for public erotica, but since we don't give it space, so right, it emerges as pornography. So for example, friend, right, the cherubs above the ark in the temple of Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, and we can date ourselves here. I don't know if you remember the movie, but I do. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones. So the ark is the Ark of the Covenant. There's sexually intertwisted cherubs above the ark. In Solomon's temple, there was also a freestanding set of cherubs. And if you read the book of Kings, Kings 1, chapter 7, verses 36 to 38, there were also cherubs embroidered, just in case you missed the point, right, on the walls, right, of the ark. So sexually intertwisted public erotic cherubs are at the center of temple consciousness. So that might be a sacred erotica, right? In other words, when we totally demonize the sexual, so it emerges both as pornography in its degraded forms and as a sexual puritanism, because there's an utter collapse of frameworks, which means universe story, narrative of identity, right, and narrative of desire. Yeah. Wow. It's exciting to be in this conversation because it's so important.
Well, I mean, I know that in the East, often the Yab Young symbol, the symbol of the man and the woman in sexual union, is a primordial symbol.
Yes.
Like the cross is a symbol or something like that. But it's a symbol of sort of erotic joy. It's not a symbol of crucifixion and death and so I always wonder if the West is just has this sense, as you say, shame of original sin, and that this is what why Protestantism has such a pathological Puritan aspect.
Yeah, no, I mean that totally. And that's a great point. I mean, just I apologize for the next sentence. My kind of rigorous intellectual historian voice pops up. So it's hard to make an East-West split here, right? In integrity, right?
Yeah.
There is Yab Yum in the East. There are also massive ascetic texts, right, in the East that kind of dominate. And, somehow the Kama Sutra kind of came through, right? And Yab Yum came through. But it's absolutely true that at the core of Eastern thought and at the core of Western thought, and in Western thought, it's the cherubs in the temple. Mm-hmm. And the cherubs in the temple are an expression of El and Astarte and Asherah in ancient Israel. See Raphael Patai's book, The Hebrew Goddesses, right? And then we've got Yab Yum, right, in the East, which are both saying the same thing. They're saying reality is Eros, right? And the sexual models the erotic, it doesn't exhaust the erotic. I mean, that's what they're saying. But tragically, they got filtered through ethnocentric prisms. They got filtered through actually anti-sexual prisms in practice. Yab Yum was, limited to initiates.
It's illegal in Sri Lanka, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it didn't actually become, tragically, the Yab Yum itself, like the cherubs got forgotten. Right, we're reading the Lost Ark. You remember Thucydides? Right, where he says in the Peloponnesian Wars, what does he say? He says, when words lose their meaning, culture collapses. Right. So we need to reclaim Yab Yum, but not as a dissociated symbol, but as this understanding that reality is Eros. Right. Yeah. And just to say, this is important, right? Because there's a lot of ableism also in the world. We're not talking about, and I want to be very tender about this, right? Sexuality works for many reasons. It doesn't work for many reasons. There's great oppression, right? Day laborers who are exhausted after 19 hours, right? All over the world, right? And we can't speak to kind of an elite European American class who have, dispensable free time and have time to go to kind of tantric seminars. We've got to actually enact a world narrative in which sexuality has a central place. And we need to create a world in which sexuality is a genuine possibility. And right now, for most people in the world, this is unbelievably important. Sexuality is not in terms of their life worlds, right? Where they live, their apartment, the amount of money they make, the amount of time they have, right? A genuine spaciousness for sexuality is actually not a real life possibility. And we need to be there's a global intimacy disorder. It's not an elite Western dispensable income intimacy disorder. And so we need to actually enact possibilities for sexuality, but we also need to broaden what we mean by sexuality. I mean, sexuality might mean, right, kissing my partner's shoulder for an hour. That's it. Mm-hmm. Right? It might be just holding each other, right, standing fully clothed in embrace, right, and just feeling the forehead, right, of my beloved, right? In other words, sexuality is much broader than a very narrow, penetrative, right, genitalia sexuality, which is a beautiful expression of sexuality. But by the sexual, that's not what we mean. We mean something much wider, right, much broader, right?
That means making sexuality a practice, not just a kind of form of
gorgeous.
Yes, it has to be a practice or a conscious practice of some kind, right?
That's the most important sentence we've said so far, Andrew. Right? In other words, we do sexuality when sexuality happens to us.
Yeah.
Right. There's and we're surprised by the urge, and all of a sudden we're hit with Cupid's arrow, which is tinged with the sexual. Oops, there it hit the secretary. That arrow is very funny, right? In other words, for us, love and desire happens to us, right? We fall into it, right? Yeah. We trip over it. But actually, right, the sexual force, sex, which is the currency, right, of cosmos, but only one expression of that currency, It's an expression of Eros. So we need to actually practice Eros, and we need to practice sexuality in a very wide range of ways, right? Because we're all holy and broken hallelujahs, right? As Leonard Cohen, famously sang. And that song, begins with, David. He saw her bathing on the roof, right? It's the David Bathsheba story, and it's a broken sexuality story from the Book of Kings. And so,
yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning Leonard Cohen, because I think he's the artist that brings together sexuality and eroticism and mysticism. Like, he does both, and that's very rare.
That is absolute. That is gorgeous. That is absolutely true. And we do something called One Mountain, Many Paths every week, which is a weekly broadcast. I started with Barbara Marks Hubbard the last 280 weeks. So we've been doing it for a while, and we do prayer every week, but not cosmic vending machine prayer, but prayer and in engaging the infinity of intimacy that knows our name. And Leonard, right, has very graciously agreed to show up every week, and we play as our hymn. We play Hallelujah. Yeah. Right. Right. And the Hallelujah, it's about, right. The holy dove was moving too, but now you never tell me what's going on below. Right. Yeah. In other words, it's this grappling with sexuality. Right. And, I couldn't feel, but I tried to touch. Right. In other words, it's this understanding that we've killed all the gods and goddesses except for Aphrodite, but we've forgotten how to worship at her altar, right? And so sexuality is at the center of consciousness, and yet we have no narrative of desire, and therefore we degrade, we Me Too, right? We go sexual puritanism, we're drenched in shame, and that drenching in shame actually is, let's tie it together, I think, root cause again for existential risk, right? Because existential risk means I have a fundamental feeling of emptiness. I've got to cover over that emptiness. I don't have access to genuine Eros, so I go for pseudo Eros.
Which it might be like, because Hallelujah is the cosmic orgasmic experience. It's not just an ordinary orgasmic experience, but it is an ordinary at the same time or something, right?
Yes, that's sex erotic. Sex erotic says, that's sex erotic. Sex erotic says there is, what's the word? Take the word orgasm for a second, then we'll go back to Hallelujah. The word orgasm plays, and I'm not making an etymological point that we'll publish in an academic paper, but it elusively plays in culture with the Hebrew word ormugzam. Orgasm is ormugzam. Ormugzam means the extreme light, which is Martin Buber wrote a book called Or HaGanuz, the extreme light, which is a collection of Hasidic stories. And the extreme light means the intensification of experience. See Whitehead in Process and Reality, who talks about intensifications of experience, the intensification of experience in which, right, I see the world in a completely different way. So imagine a psychedelic journey. Your eyes are wide open and you see with the eyes of love, right? That's what orgasm is. And what it means is my orgasm, when it's a petty, pathetic, bunch of grunts, after which I turn over, right, and have a cigarette and it's spasmodic, and I don't have any idea how that fits into the larger story of cosmos, right? I'm shamed, actually. But if I actually experience my ecstatic explosion, which I cry out, oh God, and yes, in the name of the other person, as participating in the yes of the Big Bang, participating in the field of divinity, right? It's crying out the name of other because I see them with God's eyes. Right. And that's what Cohen intuitively, he intuitively understands it. And Hallelujah means two things. It means Hallel, pristine praise, and Holelut, drunken intoxication, both of which are Yah, which is the outbreath, right, of the field of Eros.
It's also a tragic song. There's a tragedy to that song as well, though, no?
Yes.
How does the tragic fit into the sexual?
So that's beautiful, right? If that's a great, so let's talk about the tragic for a second. That's such a wonderful, wonderful inquiry, right? So let's look at three levels: pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic, which is how we begin to return to Eros. So pre-tragic sexuality means, Freud, polymorphously perverse, right? I'm doing sex, right? And whatever that means. And pre-tragic can be, by the way, sex negative. I got a clear take on sex. It's negative. or sex positive. It's all positive and beautiful. Sex neutral. Those are all pre-tragic.
Somebody wrote "sex kills" in the chat. I just noticed that.
Right, right, and that's right. Exact sex kills, and that's exactly the tragic. Now we go from the pre-tragic to the tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like right. It destroys. It's dangerous. Right. It kills. Right. It's hard. And Leonard Cohen holds that. But if you can feel Leonard Cohen, he moves from the tragic to the post-tragic.
Yeah,
right?
he does.
Right?
And there's a humor to that, right? That has something to do with humor, I think, in his case.
Yeah,
there's
totally.
something really hilarious. There's something funny that he gets, which is what elevates his song from being mere romanticism to actual genius, I think.
That's beautiful, right? There's a laughter. There's,
Yeah.
In Hebrew, the word for laughter, tzchok, appears 4 times in the book of Genesis, is also the word for sexing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They both convulse the body. They create relief. They both hold paradox. Right? Yeah. And there's a laughter, right, in sexuality. And when we try and remove laughter or remove sexuality from the field, right? Do you remember Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose? When people are being poisoned in the monastery, it turns out that there's the assistant rector has poisoned the book in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is about laughter. So whenever someone comes in and turns the page, they're poisoned and they die, right? Mm-hmm. Because the rector thinks that there's no place for laughter. So laughter is the delight of life, the delight of Eros, and the sexual is one expression of it. But we've covered a lot of ground here, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. The post-tragic.
The post-tragic, right. Zach writes a lot about that, not necessarily in the sexual realm, but I'm curious about you've talked about Hebrew Tantra, and I'm a Vajrayana, so I practiced Buddhist Tantra, and I think if I would look at the traditions that turn me on or appeal to me the most, it would be the Hebrew tradition and the Kabbalah tradition, and and you also mentioned the difference between those two traditions. So I'm curious about that.
That's great. And if just for a second, we'll just go back just to the pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic. The pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic in cosmologic humanism are not in any way about the sexual. That's one expression of them. Mm-hmm. The pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic are, core structures of reality. We all go through pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic. And, if I can, just to close that piece of the conversation, right? My favorite view of the post-tragic is Yeats, right? And his beautiful poem. How does it go? When such as I cast out remorse, so great a sweetness fills my breast. Mm-hmm. We can dance and we can sing. We are blessed by everything, and everything we look upon is blessed. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's post-tragic, and then we'll go to Vajrayana and to Kabbalah. I just want to.
I like the such as I part.
Right? When such as I, right? And I've got to cast out remorse, which is the tragic. Mm-hmm. Remorse is the tragic. Remorse is there's a major strain in Kabbalah, which identifies, right, all thanatos as excessive remorse, right? When I go beyond appropriate responsibility taking and I get lost in remorse. Mm-hmm. When such as I cast out remorse. I just want to share with you an image if I can, and then we'll go to Vajrayana and Kabbalah. I was, Andrew, in Jerusalem. Have you ever been to Jerusalem?
No, never. No. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we'll have to all go on a trip to Jerusalem. It's been too long for me as well. And the walls of the old city are completely beautiful. I mean, they're just, my whole heart melts when I think about them. And I miss Israel every day. I mean, I've my life is now kind of more international, and we're concerned with the source code of culture. And I practice in the Hebrew tradition regularly. I put on phylacteries in the morning, but I'm not identified in that sense kind of more communally, but I miss Jerusalem every day. And the walls of the outside of Jerusalem are just stunning at night. And so I was teaching in the artists' colony in Jerusalem, which is called Yamin Moshe. And it was late one night, and I had this, it was you didn't have easy access to the internet. So I had this huge satchel of like Aramaic books, and I'm walking along at midnight, kind of into the old city, and I'm walking, my head is down, and I literally feel this blast of energy coming into me. And I kind of look up and I see this couple kind of erotically engaged. And I should have, of course, looked down or left, but I didn't. I went into the shadows and I watched them, and he must have been 185. I mean, he was the oldest man I've ever seen, right? And she was probably 189, right? And they walked so slowly, it was like they were walking backwards, right? But they had such like beauty between them. And then, and I remember this like as it's happening today, I remember, she almost tripped, and we all looked down, they don't see me, and her shoelace was untied. And so he, who must have been the archetype of arthritis, right? He bends down like so slowly. And he, with these gnarled hands, right? And you could see it in the light, he ties her shoelace. And he gets up, and there was this moment, Andrew, where they exchanged a glance between them. And I you could see in the glance, you could see the pain, you could see the possible betrayals, you could see the kids or not, you could see their whole life, and they made it through. Right. And as they were here, they were. I mean, had I or you tried to tie her shoe, she would have hit us with an umbrella. Right. In other words, and that's post tragic. That's post tragic. Right. That's Eros. That's right. That's the king and the queen. That's Shiva and Shakti. Right. That's the Eros Gamos. That's the Yab Yum. Yeah. So it's all about sex. It's not about sex at all. Right. It's about that moment. And they're Shiva and Shakti. There they are. Right. Mm-hmm. So yay. So just yay. So and that's what we all want, right? And as we've got to actually embrace the pain and get to the post-tragic. If I can be just personal for a second, there was a short period in my life, about 11, 12 months, where I went through a personal tragedy back in 2006. And about a year where I didn't have the information to refute, a set of false claims. And for a year, I didn't know if I would recover my computer and ever be able to engage it. And for a year, right, I literally, I didn't stop crying. I just had tears just all the time. I couldn't chant, I couldn't sing. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't, and the tragic was so intense that what it did is it just blew me out into the post-tragic, right? Not because of any great virtue, right? Simply because of the intensification of experience. I couldn't live in the tragic, and just something blew out, and I kind of stepped into the post-tragic. And when you step into the post-tragic, it all comes alive again. Right. In other words, I remember in the middle of that time, there was a waitress in a restaurant, and I was having dinner with my friend Diane, right, who's a Zen teacher. And I remember it, and she was a little late, and the waitress comes over and says, "How are you?" And I burst into tears from the beauty of the question in the moment. Right. It was all so alive and, and vivid. And so that's the post-tragic, right? That's Eros, right? That's the Shekhinah experience. And it's what the experience of Shakti is. So I just want to kind of just have that on the table. Okay.
Thank you. That's very, very beautiful. I love the way you described that.
Mm. So we're going back to.
I love the way you put it, old person, in that picture, like, because I think that maybe the culture we kind of see Eros is something youthful, but it's the full life, isn't it?
Right. It is. Right. And I have tears in my eyes. Right. It's like, I remember reading a magazine that was popular, a place called Century Village in Florida, which is where America exiles its old people, right, to Florida, right? In other words, this dissociation, this global infinity disorder, right? You're old, go to Florida if you have excessive, funds. So there was this magazine in Century Village, and there were these, advertisements for sexuality, and Century Village is, 70, 80, 90, there's we're living much longer, right? And it said, I remember seeing that, I can see it in front of me, have sex when you're 80 like you did when you were 20. And the truth is, who wants to have sex when they're 80 like they did when they were 20? Really? Right? In other words, right? You want this to be an entirely different experience, right? And we have, you say so beautifully, we've exiled, maybe we can finish this part here. There's kind of a fivefold exile of desire. We've exiled desire from the cosmos into the human realm, exile 1. We've exiled desire from the human realm to the sexual realm, right? 2. We've exiled, to a particular form of sexuality, a kind of youthful, kind of, ecstatic, vital sexing, which is beautiful, one volume, The Phenomenology of Eros, is about vital sexing, but that's one out of 7 qualities of sexuality that we talk about there. All right. And we've exiled desire, right, to our experience with one person that we want to always be the same as it was the first time. And then we wonder, right, why we collapse, why love desire collapses, right? We don't want our sexuality at 80 to be like it was at 20, right? We want it to be an entirely different realm where we couldn't even imagine, right, the regression to where we were, where we started. So, wow, that's such a wonderful invitation. And it's the invitation of the Eros itself, of she at the center of reality. And okay, I get emotional about these things, but yes, it's a big deal, because I can feel it now, and you just have to try not to cry, right? Because the pain is so intense that people feel, right? This is not a meta-theoretical question, right? I mean, we live in a world of outrageous pain. People are outrageously pained. They feel broken and desperate. There's 1 million suicides a year, and for every suicide, there's 25 attempts, right? And then, another 100 people thinking about it, right? And, in other words, and so this is, we have to stand for life. And it's only when we stand for life that we're going to articulate a new story of life that addresses existential risk. Like that. Okay.
Existential risk. So, I've been talking to my friend Alexander. We often talk about the Exodus, in a sense that there's a movement away from the way things were and the way the culture was, and away from that corruption, and then sort of a small group of ragtag Hebrews, walking across the desert and doing something a little bit different.
It's beautiful.
And it seems like there's this linear narrative to that, but as you say, it's like all happening at once: the tragic, the post-tragic. I don't know where I was going with that. But.
Let's take that. It's beautiful, friend. Right. Is and by the way, when I say friend, I don't mean it casually. Right. We're having an intense conversation, and I'm experiencing friendship, and we think friendship, but actually, no one's a stranger. We're all potential friends. We just have to start talking to each other. Yeah. So I mean friend, not in a casual way, but in a feeling, in a real way. So you invoke this conversation with Andrew, and Andrew, we're sending you love, right? Which is this notion of kind of the ragtag band crossing the desert, right? Which is beautiful, the Exodus story. So there's a very beautiful category, right, in the Zohar. And the Zohar is, 13th century. It's the locus classicus of Hebrew mysticism. And it's called the Chavraya Kadisha, which is the holy band. And it's a description, right, of this holy band of what I call outrageous lovers, but that's a translation of a text in Psalms, Ahava Azah, outrageous love. So there's this band of outrageous lovers, right, who are actually taking responsibility for evolving the source code. And I want to land that culturally, because it's actually much more important than we think. So who are the elite today, right? So the elite today are not, who's guiding, who's taking responsibility for culture? So actually, it's not the scientists. The scientists are involved in a kind of deformation professional. Scientists today, let's say data scientists, the 10,000 best data scientists in the world are working for the 5 major tech companies. They've been hijacked, right? In the movie Don't Look Up, you've got a Nobel laureate, right, who's actually supporting, right, the corruption of the techplex, right, as they decide not to take down the comet, but to actually try and extract the comet as part of the extraction model. So science has been hijacked. We've got a broken information ecology. The priests, we're not relying on the priests. Psychology has long, outworn, right, the initial shine of attraction. So who is the band of outrageous lovers? Who are the, right? And so there's this very deep notion in the writings of Abraham Cook, and he does it just in elusive, right, passages where he kind of talks about this notion of this self-chosen elite. And when I say elite, I mean it, meaning not in a kind of flattening, right? An elite, and I would say, and I say this audaciously but humbly with enormous respect, I'd say virtually everyone on this call today is part of that elite, meaning this matters to us. Existential risk matters, right? Telling the new story
Well,
matters.
we are this ragtag band. I have the sense anyway. Yes.
Right. We are that. That's right.
Yeah.
And so Parallax is one expression of this ragtag band. And the Center for Critical Wisdom is another expression. And our friends at Consilience are another expression, right? But in other words, and we're connected to each other. And we're actually, I started the think tank 11, 12 years ago. And I've often said to Daniel, to Zach, to Ken, to Sally, right, to Lori, to Christina, to Claire, to Shahat, to the whole gang, right, is that actually our public guise is a think tank. That's our cover. Right? That's our covers that we're a think tank, right? But actually, we're a band of outrageous lovers, right? And we live in a world of outrageous pain. And the only response to outrageous pain is outrageous love. And outrageous love means that we actually realize that and outrageous love is Eros. Same thing. Meaning it's the Eros of cosmos lives in me. And I'm not a local story and I'm not local desire. And that, I could say the whole thing in just 2 lines. We could just say it in 2 lines, right? We go back to the story, right? Citation that we did 40 minutes ago. We just say reality is not a fact, it's a story. Right? There's a narrative arc to cosmos, right? Matter, life, mind, and all the levels of matter and all the levels of biological life, all the levels of the self-reflective human mind, right? So reality is a narrative arc to reality. Reality is a story. It's not an ordinary story. It's a love story. It's an amorous cosmos, right? The allurement that holds subatomic particles also invites Andrew into his tantric Buddhism, right? There's a progressive deepening of intimacies, right? And it's an evolutionary love story. It's an outrageous love story. And I'm a unique configuration of outrageous love, right? And my story, my narrative arc, right, is evolution living uniquely through me. My story is chapter and verse in the universe, a love story. Now, here's the thing. That's the best scientific understanding of who we are, right? That's not declaration, right? That's not a claim. If you actually merge the interior and exterior sciences, complexity theory, systems theory, chaos theory, molecular biology, the unbelievably important work, done on natural genetic engineering by James Shapiro at University of Chicago, Barbara McClintock and her Nobel Prize, right, in the 80s, right? Lynn Margulis, if you actually merge the interior and exterior sciences, what we just said is actually the most accurate understanding of who I am. That's shocking. That's like, wow. That's actually, in other words, that's not an illusion.
So the outrageousness is this excess and overflow and constant creative movement.
Well, outrageous means, right? The word outrage has a number of etymologies, but let's just say outrageous means it's not ordinary, right? So ordinary love is very often a strategy of the ego, of security, a cultural construction. Outrageous love means, I'll say it this way, okay? Right? When you hold hands with someone with ordinary love, your hands get a little clammy and you're trying to get them out of there and you're not quite sure what to do and it's a little inappropriate. Whoa. When you hold hands with someone and you feel outrageous love moving through you, right? You're stepped into eternity. But eternity, not everlasting time, but Wittgenstein's eternity, the eternity that lives beneath time, right? I don't know if you have kids, Andrew. I have 4 kids.
2 kids, yeah.
Right? 2 kids, yay. So I remember holding, right, my first child, right? Rachel, her mother got very sick and went to the hospital. And this was, the placenta was actually left in it. She almost died. Thank God she was fine. And I was for 4 days with Rachel. And oh my God, I did not know what to do with myself. I've never had a harder 4 days, by the way. In those 4 days, it was 29 hours a day, but I'm holding her. And when I was trying to kind of ordinary love and get her to stop crying, right, I got nowhere. But then when I would get calm and I would actually feel the Eros of cosmos moving through me in my arms, literally, Andrew, she would just nestle into me, right, at home and just lay down and we just stepped into eternity, right? And so outrageous love means, on the one hand, it's the quality and fabric of Eros of cosmos itself, but it means something else. It also has the word outrage in it. My friend who was one of the original chairs of the think tank, a wonderful man, John Mackey. John and I had a conversation. John said, we got to change it to unlimited love. Right? Outrageous is it's got anger in there. But actually it should have anger in there.
It should have anger in there. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
People
right.
are
It
trying
should.
to clean things up. It's terrible. I think that's right.
That's
It should
right.
have outrage in it. Yeah, I agree.
It needs outrage in it. It
Hmm.
needs outrage in it, right? There's in the Talmud in the 5th century in Tractate Ta'anit on page 4a, there's this beautiful passage which talks about the anger of the prophet,
Yeah.
right? And we need prophetic anger, right?
Yeah.
And we need, I don't know if is sometimes cinema captures the voice of she. So about 30 years ago in the West, I'm trying to remember now, there's a movie called Network, right? Which was about a network, announcer who was fired.
Mm-hmm.
He asks for one more moment on the air, and they give him the moment on the air, right? And he says, and he starts this rant, and he says, I want everyone to go to the window and open the window and cry out, I just can't take it anymore. I'm angry. I won't take it anymore. And all of a sudden, all over the world, right, this surprise, right? Everyone's running to their window, right? Because there's this collapse of Eros and they're screaming out, I can't take it anymore. I'm angry. I'm mad. And we have to actually access sacred rage. And rage means not narcissistic rage, that my egoic, contracted, small self has been somehow offended. More, I have prophetic rage. And we need to, Cook talks about the democratization of prophecy. Every unique self is a mini prophet, right? There's a unique voice, right, of Eros, of divine Eros that courses through me. And it's why I can meet Andrew and I can fall in love, because I say, I'm not supposed to be Andrew. Andrew's unique voice is Vajrayana, right? And the glasses, right? And, the great hair, right? And the beautiful, right? And it's just his soft voice and his clarity, right? And everything he's doing, that's his to do. And I get to be ecstatic that unique voice comes through Andrew, because here we are, these two unique self-outrageous lovers meeting each other, as opposed to a separate self meeting, which is grasping, it's rivalrous conflict based on win-lose metrics. Yeah. So that's where we need to go. And we need to claim outrage, right, as part of our inherent dignity and our inherent motivational and moral architecture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And outrage is kind of appropriate, especially I think today, because we're in these little screens all the time, and it's like how much pent up rage there must be inside of people, and that is energy which could be expressed and become clarity or something, right?
That's gorgeous. And actually, the Hebrew word, and when I use Hebrew or Sanskrit, right, I'm actually, in the sense, I'm using it in the sense, for example, that Chomsky, right, talks about language, where language reflects, even Wittgenstein understood it. It's one of the places that Wittgenstein kind of got essentialism, that language is expressing something core in reality. So in the original Hebrew, the word for rage and love is the same word, right, in two ways. One is chom, C-H-O-M, love, affection. Chema, used in the Scroll of Esther, for example, means rage. So love and anger are the same word. And even the word hav, right, which is ahava, love, hav is a 2-letter root, means both the flame of ecstasy and the flame of outrage. Yeah. Right. And so we need to, right. And here's the thing. Our outrage has to move. That's what the evolution of love is. Right. And I have to be willing to get angry when it's not about me. That's the thing. Right. In other words, and I've got to be willing to get angry, right, when not just when there's a violation of my egocentric frame of intimacy, not just when my people have been betrayed, whoever my people are, my ethnocentric intimacy, but actually I'm outraged when there's a violation of world-centric intimacy, right? Every human being on the planet, but it's even more than that. I can't be sitting eating lamb chops, which are a result of actually torturing a lamb for 3 months, intensely torturing them, which I've completely dissociated from because I'm only world-centric, only human beings, and animals and their pain is irrelevant to me and I have no shared identity with animals, intimacy formula. There's no mutuality of pathos. There's no mutuality of shared identity. And so therefore I'm going to torture an animal for 3 months so I can have a 15-second succulent experience of swallowing a lamb chop. Well, if you do that, you're a motherfucker. Right? Because you've dissociated both from the appropriate rage, right, and from intimacy. And by the way, in 100 years, we're going to look at the way we treat animals, and we're going to be filled with shock, right? But it's not just animals. We dissociate. We don't just, right? We dissociate from our own rage, and we locate our rage in this very narrow, petty constraint, which is manipulated by a lowest common denominator internet, which is actually designed, right, to undermine my choices, to undermine my free will, et cetera. That's a larger conversation. Zach and I are finishing a book called Techno-Feudalism, about that. But yes, this is the critical frame outrage. So outrageous love, right? It's outrageous in that it keeps every boundary that should be kept, and it breaks every boundary that should be broken. Right, like that. Yay. Beautiful. Shah. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm okay. Okay. I'm just
checking in.
I'm wondering where to go next.
Oh my God. I mean, there's 1,000 places to go, of course, but I mean, maybe we could. I mean, in other words, and I know we want to get to Q&A, and I want to be aware of time, and I know. Yeah, I totally. Maybe we put one last thing on the table, just so we'll have it on the table, and then we can. I also know that we invited people from One Mountain and to come, and I know they were only able to stay an extra hour, so I'm sure they've had to drop off, and I want to really honor people's evenings there. But maybe we can put one last thing on the table. Sure. Right, which is uniqueness, right? Because it's one of the things that Zach and I have been studying together since 2008 or 9. It's been a road. And one of the central categories we put on the table early on, 2009, 10, 11, was pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic, and this notion of uniqueness. And Zach actually deployed the notion of uniqueness stunningly in his super excellent book on education. Yep. Where there's a chapter which kind of deals with unique self. And when we did a special issue of the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice, right, I wrote, I edited and wrote a bunch of articles, but Zach wrote a very, very good article there on models of teaching, and Suzanne Cook-Reuter wrote, we did a couple of great dialogues. But unique self is really critical for everything, right? Because what unique self says is that there's an answer to the question of who are you? And the answer to the question of who are you and who are we, right, is the Archimedean lever, which is the fulcrum that can actually change everything, right? It's the beginning of a new story, which creates a new vector. And by the way, I take issue with my colleague Yuval Harari on just about everything, right? In other words, I think that his books are gorgeously done and a disaster, right? Right, in terms of their kind of architecture. And Zach and I are actually writing a response, and we've articulated something which we call homo amor, right? And so I want to try and just maybe finish with that, because homo amor is absolutely critical. In other words, we've talked today a lot about desire, a lot about sexuality. I was, wildly privileged with Dr. Christina Kincaid to do this phenomenology of Eros. So that kind of holds Eros and sexuality, and Claire Molinaire is kind of enacting, this unique self institute. And at the very core of everything is what we're calling homo amor, right? And so homo amor, if I can express it just in 2 minutes, right? But it's actually critical, because what Yuval is doing is he's a kind of, again, Chaim Soloveitchik, who's a medievalist scholar, talks about uncontaminated sources. And what he means by that is when someone's blithely repeating something that's a given, right, in the mainstream structures of education, power, and authority. So Yuval is that. He hasn't thought these issues through, right? He's repeating the kind of accepted understandings that Pinker's accepted and Zuboff's accepted.
That's what you're saying about Sam Harris. I feel it's a kind of pseudo-Buddhism or something, which is taking on materialism.
Right. Sam's a better thinker, right? He's thinking it through, but he has axiomatic suppositions of materialism that he's not willing to let go of for a number of reasons. And he caricatures. Exactly. His book, The End of Faith, is a complete caricature. He creates a straw man, then he kills the straw man. No, totally. So we're responding to what he calls Homo sapien and Homo Deus with something we're calling Homo Amor, right? And so Homo Amor is, right, the movement from separate self to true self. Right, true self means I'm one with the field, right? Then true self plus unique perspective plus unique quality of intimacy equals unique self. I'm an irreducibly unique expression of the field, plus the evolutionary context equals evolutionary unique self. Playing my instrument in the larger we equals unique self symphony. But I want to get just, to conclude with just the unique self part really clear, because it's very helpful. So if I basically get, who are you? And we go back to that statement that we talked about earlier, but I want to conclude with it because it's at the center of everything. When I actually re-experience my own identity, and I actually realize that I'm intended by cosmos and I'm chosen and I'm recognized and I'm needed and I'm desired, right? And I'm intended, right? It actually changes my essential experience. So who are you, right? So you're an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence, the love beauty and love desire that is the initiating and animating Eros and energy of all that is, that lives in you, as you, and through you. That never was, is, or will be ever again other than through you. And as such, you have a unique quality of intimacy and a unique perspective, which come together to form your unique way of being in the world and to activate your unique gift, which addresses a unique need in your unique circle of intimacy and influence that no one that ever was, is, or will be can give that gift other than you. And in doing that, you manifest your unique capacity to respond, your unique responsibility, which you can only fulfill if you're willing to take your unique risk.
Unique risk. Beautiful.
And unique risk is an unbelievably important
because until you said that, I thought it was a little bit Pollyanna until you said that. And then I said, okay, yes.
No, your unique risk changes the whole, and by the way, you picked it up as you've done throughout the dialogue. You picked it up precisely. That's unique risk changes the whole thing. It electrifies it. Yeah. Right. In other words, most people don't live their unique self. They're living an imitative version. They're in an imitation game. Yeah. Right. And idolatry in the Aramaic sources is imitation. Mm-hmm. Right. In other words,
well, we were talking about René Girard a lot, and this mimetic,
yes,
which leads to the scapegoat mechanism, which leads to sort of probably that has something to do with shame as well, and that would be
and the murder of Eros.
And the murder of Eros.
And the murder. Girard is describing the murder of Eros, and actually the word that's beautiful. The word in Hebrew for idolatry is avodah zarah. Avodah zarah means strange worship. But what it means is you remember George Steiner, right? Strangers are we, errants at the gates of our own psyche. Meaning I'm not living the Eros of my unique self. And and maybe this is the last sentence, all collapses in ethics are rooted in a failure of Eros. That's we have to reweave the relationship between the erotic and the ethical. No rule-based morality, although we need rules and they're important. But they've got to be rooted in a larger Eros. Whenever there's a failure of Eros, ethics breaks down, and my unique self is my Eros. So as long as Andrew Sweeney is being Andrew Sweeney with all of the holy and broken hallelujah, and he's taking his unique risk, and he's in the deepest integrity he can be, he might experience agony and ecstasy, but he's in the right life, right? And as he's right, and he feels the fullness of Eros moving through him, right? And there's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you heard. Right, the holy and the broken hallelujah. That's unique self. So the response to the meta crisis has to be a new story. At the center of a new story has to be unique self, and that's homo amor. Homo amor is the realization that the love intelligence and love beauty and love desire of reality move uniquely through me, and that I have unique, outrageous acts of love to commit, right? That are my holy delight, my holy joy, and my holy obligation. We need to resuscitate obligation. Obligation is real, and that's a great place to end.
Okay, that is a great place. And an hour and a half is somehow that seems to be the right place to go into questions. Perfect. As well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the. If you'll forgive me, I'm a little bit new with all this Zoom stuff. So I'm going to open up the room. So which means I need to. I need to remove the spotlight from everybody, from me and you, and then And then so that people can jump in and ask questions. Hold on a second. I have to remove my own spotlight.
Also, Andrew, I just want to thank all these people. Lots of people wrote stuff. The chat box is filled with people kind of jotting. That's gorgeous. Wow. Thank you, everyone. Oh my God.
Thank you, everyone. And it's hard. And I haven't got to that yet because I'm so immersed in this conversation. Oh, so now I'm pinned and I don't know how to unpin myself. Hold on. How do I unpin myself? Can I? Okay, I'm putting it on gallery. Is everybody just looking at me, or are we looking at it? Are we all looking at each other yet? Okay, there we go. So can we see the room now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we can see the room. We have 54 people still here. There were about 70 at one point. Nice big crowd. It's great. So let's just ask people to. It's really not possible for me to go through the chat spontaneously. So I wonder if you have your maybe if you have your questions, you could write them in the chat, and then you could step in and actually speak them. Or if you preferred, I read them. We'll do that. How does that sound?
Fantastic. I mean, if people can write questions in the chat and then, either unmute themselves or Andrew, read them, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Just unmute yourself if you can, if you don't feel comfortable speaking. This will be on YouTube. I'll read it for you. So I'm waiting for questions here.
Right. And just to say, we did so much, right? We covered so much ground. So I totally also understand that it takes time to absorb. Right. And so and I think you could
also just put up your hand also with the reactions button. You could do it that way. If you had something just immediate that you wanted to say or express or ask Mark.
Yeah, totally. Or if people don't want to write it and they want to just unmute themselves and speak a question, anyone from any place. I saw an earlier question in the chat. Right?
Is there a question in the chat?
Yeah, how do you move from tragic to post-tragic?
Okay. And who is that who asked the question? Do they want to show themselves or it's not obligatory, of course. Anyway, go ahead and answer the question, Mark.
A great question. It's a fantastic question. Jonah. Right. Jonah asked the question. So thank everybody we have a unique self-symphony happening, Andrew, in our chat box, which is wonderful. Right. So it's a great and critical question, right? And there's a bunch of new questions coming. How do I move from tragic to post-tragic? It's a brilliant question. So there's three ways. And when I say three ways, I don't mean that in a kind of authoritative, dogmatic way, but there's kind of three major paths. One is a new story, right? In other words, I got lost in the tragic because the way I interpreted reality in the old story I was living in brought me to the tragic, right? So for example, sexuality, right? I hit the tragic because I don't have a narrative of sexuality in which I can live. And so therefore I pathologize and I don't mythologize, right? And I can't actually locate myself in a larger eros, which is super important. Okay, so that's one. Right. So I actually need a new story to get me from the tragic to the post-tragic. I've talked to, a number of people. Right. One of them is a wonderful man named Perry Marshall, who's done some really important work on evolution. He wrote a very, very good book called Evolution 2.0. And he shared with me a conversation with his brother, where his brother had run into the inadequacies of creationism. And creationism is not without merit. Intelligent design is not without merit, but it ultimately runs into an inadequate, right, set of challenges which he can't answer adequately. And he felt, his brother felt broken, right? Meaning has disappeared, and he got kind of embraced, if you will, by the tragic nature of life. And it was only by articulating a new narrative of evolution and actually integrating all sorts of pieces of information into a new evolutionary story, he was able to move to the post-tragic. But let me give you a different vision of it, make it much more personal. Let's say my story is a victim story. I experienced myself as a victim. One of the leaders on our board is a gentleman named Terry Nelson, who led, 1,000 seminars in America, right, in which he talked about, how do I move from a victim story, right, to a story in which I'm not a victim? And we call it the movement, right, in cosmological humanism, from victim to player, right? How do I move from victim to player? As long as I'm a victim in my story and I keep telling the victim story, I'm stuck in the tragic. But I've got to change the story in which I'm not a victim, I'm a player. So changing the story, right, is one way. Second way, right, is actually changing my interior experience. Right? I actually have an experience which is a post-tragic experience. Now, that could be a psychedelic journey. Right? Actually, wow. All right. I haven't changed my story. You get the distinction, everyone, right? I haven't changed my story. I've changed my experience. I have a direct access to an experience in which I experience the post-tragic nature of reality, right? And again, there's many ways to do that. It could be dance. And I went dancing one night, and all of a sudden, I found myself on the dance floor, and the dance floor is post-tragic, right? Right. When you dance, you somehow understand that you're going to fall right, and you can trust, right, to empty yourself out, right? The Hebrew word for dance is mechol, which means both dance and emptying yourself out, and also means forgiveness. And so I can kind of forgive myself, empty myself out, right, and then be filled, right, with the experience of dance. So that's two, right? And three, the last one is similar to the second, but it's a unique track, which is to fall in love. But when I say fall in love, it might be with a person, it might be with a reality, it might be with an idea. Right? We have to give ourselves permission to fall in love. I fall in love 10 times a week with new ideas, right? With new people, right? With new vistas, right? When I say fall in love, I don't mean romantically. As everyone understands, we've exiled falling in love to a very narrow romantic sexual encounter. I don't mean romantically or sexually, right? Right? I fall in love, right, all the time, right? With different dimensions of reality, because actually, not because, right, I'm weird, which may be true, right? But not because of that, right? Because actually falling in love, it's what Meister Eckhart wrote, falling in love is the interior nature of reality. Reality is falling in love with itself, kissing in every moment. And when I actually access that quality of reality, I access a freshness, right? They called it in German a Freshkeit. And a Freshkeit means it's both audacious and it's fresh, it's new. So I've got to fall in love means I can see with new eyes. Right. And I can actually access reality again, right. With a second innocence. I've revirginated. And so those are three specific, but meta paths to move from kind of the pre-tragic, right. From the tragic to the post-tragic. Okay. So I think that's
wonderful. I think David has his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, David? And I'll pin you so you can, Wait.
Yeah, great. I've been loving this conversation, and I know you've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people, and you read a lot of different books, and I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what your biggest takeaway from this topic was. I mean, we went to so many areas, and I'm curious to know how you make sense of it, especially like in terms of like all the different things that you've been studying and discussing with a lot of people. It's a big question, so I don't know how you want to take it. That's for you, Andrew.
I think that was to you, Andrew.
That was a question for me. What's my biggest takeaway from this? Oh, my biggest takeaway from this is that Marc is a great guy, and I want to hear more from him. And I'm just really happy to meet him. I think that I think I really agree with a lot of the things he's saying, and I think I'm really in resonance with many of them. And it's a very refreshing voice. And I'm glad that we're talking about Eros and instead of a lot of the discussion is very autistic and dry and technical, and or else it's just angry and passionate. It's like either this reified masculinity or this out of control femininity, if I can caricaturize a little bit, and I think well, anyway, that's my biggest take, and I hope I can continue this conversation with Marc.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. David, thank you for the question, and Andrew, thank you. That was beautiful.
Okay.
Yay.
So there was somebody else there.
It was how do I find my unique self? I see that one. Is that okay to handle that one, Andrew?
Go ahead, and then we'll get Raquel, who also has her hand up. So
okay, fantastic. So how do I handle my unique self? That's all right. How do I find my unique self? And of course, we all understand that we're alluding, we're doing pointing out instructions, to borrow the Tibetan Buddhist phrase, and obviously that's a big conversation, and we actually wrote a couple of books on it, and all of that, right? But let me just try and get it for a second. So there's a text written in the mystical diaries, right, of one of the Hebrew mystics of this generation, which was not intended to be published. And right, he addresses something which is really, really important, which is, who are you for real, right? And so, for example, in psychology, right, you are the sum total of your past moments. The past is utterly essential, right? And you're also, in some sense, Freud, you're these dark, raging impulses that need somehow to be sublimated and brought under control, right? In the kind of balance of ego and superego and id, et cetera, right? But who you really are, whoa, that's intense, right? That's dark. That's one notion. There's another notion in the social engineers of the 19th century, Bentham and Mill, right, which is ultimately more concerned with your social self, right, and your function in society. But actually, there's another dimension of self, which is, this is a pointing out instruction, which allows you direct access to your unique self. And that is, I'm going to cite the original text because I can see it in my mind, and I'll translate it. It says, Amitat Mahuti Mitgale Berig'e Gadluti, which is the essence of who I am is revealed in my moment of greatness. And that's just so wonderful. Right? There's a moment in which I run faster than I can run. Right? I speak more beautifully than I can speak. My heart's more open than it ever was. Right? In other words, in that moment when I'm being most me, right? I'm most personified in my deepest expression, my widest expression of goodness, truth, and beauty of Eros. That actually is not an aberration. That's who I am. Right? And so what I need to do is, what we do today in society is we pathologize people, right, in what we think is their moment of scandal. We don't even know how to gather information to determine what's true because we have a broken information ecology. But let's say a person makes a mistake, because we all make mistakes. We're all making mistakes, right? So we find a person's mistake, we freeze frame on their mistake, we identify them with that mistake, right? And that becomes the end of the story, right? Which is tragic, right? We move to the post-tragic when of course, we confess our responsibility, but it's much harder to confess your greatness. So let's create a new order, right? The confession of greatness, right? And you can access your greatness, and we need to democratize greatness, right? A democratization of enlightenment. One of the friends I've talked to, my friends Daniel and Zach, about for the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've had wonderful conversations on the democratization of enlightenment, which means, and it's at the core of the Unique Self Institute, right? It's actually in the logo, the democratization of greatness. I mean, I've got to confess my greatness. And I confess my greatness by actually accessing those moments in my life when I was most beautiful, when I was most good, when I was most true, and understanding that's the only confession that ever holds me accountable, right? When I confess my sins, and of course I should take responsibility when it's appropriate, right? But I want to actually know that if I'm just basically pathology, well, what does the world expect from me? The world has no reason to make any demand on me. But if who I am is that greatness, if the essence of who I am is revealed in my moment of greatness, that's my unique self. That's when the uniqueness of cosmos poured through me. Then I'm called by, that's my confession, because that's confessing my essential nature. And it's that essential nature which calls me forward. So imagine that we enact a world in which we confess our greatness. And you think that's easy. It's not. Right? To confess my greatness is a very big deal. It's the biggest demand I can ever make. And it's a demand that emerges from the Eros of cosmos uniquely voicing through me. Confession of greatness. That's where unique self comes from. So there's a lot of ways we could have engaged that, but that's one, which is, fast, but it's holding something, super important. So thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Wow.
Great.
Yeah.
It makes me think that's the transcendence of original sin or something like that. Like this notion.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Exactly. It's actually my original greatness. And Buddhism did us a great disservice when they talked about original face being true self. right? And its original face is not true self. Original face is unique self. Unique self is the unique expression of true self, right? And and I've got to actually be able to disambiguate separateness and uniqueness. If I can't disambiguate separateness and uniqueness and I collapse them, and I create a disaster both on the Western side and the Eastern side. The Eastern side collapses separateness and uniqueness and says, I got to move beyond both my separateness and my uniqueness, right? So they collapse separate self and unique self. The Western side says, my dignity is in my separate self. No, my dignity is in my unique self. So the West is afraid to move beyond my separate self because they locate dignity in separation. It shouldn't be. I can move beyond separate self, be part of the field, the seamless code of the universe. But I know the code of the universe is seamless, but not featureless. And this is what Andrew said, everyone, but it only comes alive when I take my unique risk, right? And it's, you can't access unique self without taking unique risk. And maybe we'll do a whole dialogue one day on how do you identify unique risk? What's the difference between a foolhardy risk, right? Which is a separate self risk, and a unique risk. But there is no possibility of becoming your unique self without unique risk. So unique risk is essential here.
Mm-hmm.
Yay.
Beautiful. Okay.
Yay.
How about you, Raquel? Did you want to ask your question? I'll put you in the spotlight.
Unmute myself. Yes. So I would like to go back to the tragic to post-tragic. And Mark, you said some things about that, and I want to relate this with initiation. And one of the things that I read about initiation is described as a contained encounter with death, whereas trauma is described as an uncontained encounter with death. And so it seems to me like, is trauma that what gets us into the tragic? And
it's beautiful.
And I would like to relate this, because what you say to me sounds very, very focused on the individual. And one of the things that I understand is the soul being not just individual, kind of private experience. Like, how is this also carried by the community? How is the community a container?
Okay, so that's all that, Raquel, that's fantastic. That's a fantastic set of inquiries, right? You've already got two big ones on the table. So I'm going to go for those because those are so big and so good and so insightful. I mean, the question is so insightful on so many levels. So I just want to honor the depth of insight. So that's fantastic. And thank you. And so you're saying two separate things, and I think they're both unbelievably important, right? So one is the distinction between an initiation and trauma, which is extremely important, right? And the understanding of trauma as an uncontained death experience, right? And initiation is a contained death experience. So the first thing to say is that we cannot move to the post-tragic until we encounter death, right? And I think it's a mistake, right? And Andrew, this is a larger conversation. I know that Alexander's thought about this, but I think it's an utter mistake, right, to suggest that death is finality. I think that's an empirical mistake, right? On multiple levels, that's a very big conversation. Zach and I have a draft of a book on death, right, and 12 anthropological doors to death, and I look forward to that conversation with you and with Andrew. And I know that's a big topic, but we absolutely, and Raquel, you are just brilliantly pointing us in the right direction, which is we have to encounter death, and an uncontained encounter with death, right, with thanatos, with destruction, with violation, right, in which there's a death of my intrinsic value. And that's what violation means, right? When I become only instrumental to someone else's end, right? When I become, but a vessel with my own intrinsic dignity, right? Not upheld, right? That is the death of my personhood, right? And that's an uncontained experience of death, right? And initiation is my actual ability to face into the depth of my death, because even if death is not final, it has a finality. And we have to experience the finality of death either way. And we can't take a Pollyannish view, which says, well, there's continuity of consciousness, no problem. The Crusaders were really good at that, and that didn't go well. We have to encounter the finality of death, and it's only death that presses us into life, but then that's to be contained. But by contained, the word container in Hebrew is kli, and kli means right? Kli means vessel, container, and it also means, right, the depth yearning of cosmos. So a kala is a bride because of her yearning, right? So in other words, right, my encounter with death has to be part of, right, my deeper experience of desire and yearning and how those relate to death. So that's a bigger conversation we won't have, because I want to get to the second part of what you said, which is there is no unique self, and I'm so glad you said it, without unique self symphony. In other words, there's never, right? There's no possibility to discuss unique self is never about individualism, right? The only mature individuality is in the context of union. And that's unbelievably important. And union is not fusion. It's union. It's intimacy, shared identity in the context of relative otherness. But if I don't experience myself as part of the intimate communion of the larger community, right, then I can't actually, right, go home and I can't address existential risk. But we have no larger communion today, because communion, right, is based on intimacy, and intimacy is based on a shared story. So you beautifully at the end, there's a book in the first century called the Book of Creation, which says that in a great conversation, Sofan na'utz b'tchilatan u'tchilatan na'utz b'sofan. The end is in the beginning and the beginning is in the end. And so Andrew and I started with existential risk and the global intimacy disorder and the breakdown of a shared story. Without a shared story of value, not a conjectured shared story, but a genuine shared story of value rooted in first principles and first values, we can't have communion. Right? There is no shared community, right, based on only a covenant of fate. We need a covenant of value. So when there's a breakdown of first principles and first values, right, then we don't actually have the experience, right, of communion. And communion is evolutionary we space. It's unique we, right? It's the delight of community. And one of the reasons that there's such an attraction to cults is because we're attracted to the pre-personal, because we haven't actually articulated an evolutionary we space, a unique self community. So I know there's a lot more to go back and forth on that, and we will, and I look forward to it. But I hope we at least began a conversation, right, to respond to your two just, devastatingly important and beautiful insights. So super thank you.
Great.
Yay.
How about you, Madalena? Do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Hi, Mark. Thank you for
Madalena.
this. Wonderful. I think, Andrew, you'll agree that he's ecstatic too.
Yes. Actually, I gave that compliment to Madeline because she's been showing up at my events recently and in a state of ecstatic ideation. And I always love things
Wonderful.
to say.
Yay. Welcome, sister.
Yeah, the outrageousness is raving, Anyway, I don't know, maybe it's because of your constant reference to the Hebrew sources. And for me, it's Spinoza. And as an excommunicated and banned and forbidden, for centuries. I mean, even in 2006, he was judged again and excommunicated again. And yes. I find that in this time between worlds, that excommunication is something we would do well to revisit.
Let's do, no, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. Let's do it right now together. Okay. Right. I'm madly in love with Spinoza. Let's do it. Let's right now together. Let's do it. Let's rescind the communication. Let's do it right here.
That whole thing of uniqueness, is he refers to the ingenium, ingenio, no? And that is just the minute particular differentiality that is expressed in modalities of a single substance, the monist. Yes. And to juxtapose something more from this time and coming from a completely different place, there's a Black Brazilian philosopher, Denise Ferreira da Silva. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but you should be. And she speaks of different without separability. And speaking of your equations, I find that equation to be stripped of the expectations of quote unquote love, because I think, as Rimbaud said, love needs to be reinvented. And I think it's very, dangerous to bring these terms and all that they've been bombarded with salvationist narratives, because we risk not the unique risk, we risk the normal pathologizing risk.
Yeah, beautiful. And Amanda, those are, you made 3 or 4 different beautiful and important points, if I can just gently, right? And I love each of them. So let's just do Spinoza first, right? So Spinoza was an incredibly important figure and actually expresses something which is core, right, to the Zohar and to kind of the Hebrew wisdom sciences. He was excommunicated. I think that was a huge mistake by the community. I think it was one of the most tragic mistakes. And I hereby, right, in my official, rabbinic capacity, although I don't, exercise that in the world today, I want to hereby revoke, right, the excommunication of Spinoza and welcome Spinoza, right, into the community fully and absolutely, right? So that's one.
Wow, this is a moment. This is a
big moment. We have now revoked. We have revoked the excommunication, and here's 2, and 2 is also important. Spinoza in Tractus 5 misunderstood something. But he got it almost all right, but he misunderstood something essential. In Tractus 5, what he does is he relates and understands the Hebraic moment, what Matthew Arnold calls Hebraism as opposed to Hellenism. He understands it as obedience. And that's a mistaken understanding of the Talmudic tradition. He views it as a kind of a frozen moment of theophany, of revelation in time, right, which gets lost in a kind of obedience that needs to be vivified. No, he was absolutely right about that, but he misunderstood the obedience part. And the reason is, and this is very subtle, very deep, and we won't be able to exhaust it today, but what he basically thought was that, and he thought it because everyone thought it at his time. There was no one who was able to think beyond it because evolution wasn't quite in play. So he becomes a pantheist, but he's not evolutionary yet, right? So what he basically thought was that there's this frozen frame of value imposed by a homo revelatus, right? By a revealing, a deus revelatus, a revealing God. And human beings are caught in the trap of servitude and obedience to this God, which was the caricature of pre-modernity and was what much of public religion was in pre-modernity. And Spinoza was correctly, right? Spinoza was one of 3 critical figures that birthed modernity. What Spinoza didn't understand, because he couldn't have at that time, just like Rilke. Rilke was rebelling against certain moments in modernity. He couldn't get the next step. Spinoza had to do what Spinoza did. Spinoza didn't understand the notion of evolving value in a participatory cosmos, which is what the Talmud's actually about, even though much of Orthodoxy doesn't realize that, which is the human voice participates in the divine voice. Spinoza would have loved that. Right. So in other words, right, there's actually Spinoza was a critical moment. He couldn't quite get to a participatory cosmos. Right? He couldn't quite access those sources. They're very, very hidden, in which actually it's not quite pantheism, but it's actually when the human voice and the divine voice, right, actually merge into one, and there's an ontic identity of wills. Right. So Spinoza didn't imagine that as a possibility in the Hebrew tradition. Look at Tractus 5. But, he did so well, and he was so beautiful, and he was so gorgeous. He gets to make a mistake, right? And he had a massive contribution. He was this massively important figure. One of my favorite books ever written was by Yirmiyahu Yovel, right, on Spinoza. So that's unbelievably important. In terms of, Denise, right, this notion of different but not separate, right, is beautiful. Right. That's exactly unique self. That's gorgeously expressed. I am not familiar with her work. And if you have a chance, right, put it in the chat box or email it to me. I'd love to take a look at it. So I'm now already your student and I'm in your debt. So thank you. Super, super appreciated. And your point about love is absolutely true. I don't like using the word love. Right. I prefer Eros or outrageous love or evolutionary love. And the reason we're trying to create a new field of language is because love is a word that's gotten desiccated, right? And, in a certain sense, maybe I'll finish it with this. We know who we are, Madeline, as you know, by what we say at our moment of death, right? And we don't say anymore a sacred creed. Right? We don't say "Hear, O Israel," or we don't do, the Lord's Prayer, or we don't do, Om Mani Padme Om. What do we say at our moment of passing? So you remember, of course, I'm sure we all do, the tragedy of the World Trade Center. And we recovered people's cell phones. And so we actually all of a sudden had this access. And what people said was, "I love you." That's what people said. That was the sacred creed. And that's what I meant earlier. The only altar we have left to worship at is Aphrodite. But we don't know how to worship because we've minimized love. We've made it so small. We've hijacked it in so many ways. And so we need to revivify the field of love as the field of Eros, right? The amorous cosmos, in which our love participates in the larger field. Because otherwise, when love is small, love becomes vicious. Love becomes dangerous. Love becomes cruel, right? Small love becomes small-minded. And so the expansion of consciousness, what Luria called mochin de gadlut, right? The expansion of consciousness is the expansion of identity, right? It's the expansion of universe story, which is the expansion of the divine. It's the evolution of God. Nikos Kazantzakis wrote, right? We're the saviors of God, right? But not the caricatured God, right? So let's hold it there. That's a start.
That's a little bit, like Simone Weil and all that. But, I'm sort of tempted to quote, and I don't want to hoard the space, but, Ivan Illich, the corruption of the best is the worst, is the sort of tension Beautiful. I feel in your message, which of course it's like an hour and a half. I know, your books, go into the minute particulars, but I think this moment calls for epistemic humility, not shame, but epistemic humility. I mean,
and audacity together. The dialectic of humility and audacity, epistemic humility and epistemic boldness at the same time, which is non-dogmatic, but rooted in a radical empiricism, which includes the eye of the heart and the eye of the spirit and the eye of the mind and the eye of the senses. Absolutely.
But for example, just to throw in one last piece, my radical empiricism has taken on, cuttlefish as a cognitive partner.
Wow. Yay. Beautiful. Yay.
Mostly,
got it.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Beautiful. No, that's gorgeous. That's gorgeous.
And this is part of this sort of other connectivity that we live in, that I can even, without being a diver, that I can even see a cuttlefish in action, where this question of a unique self and identity vaporizes. I mean, completely, with great joy, but it's not a dissolution in this sort of Buddhist sense that everything's an illusion. It's the being what you have to be in that moment.
So I'm going to be careful, and everything you said is gorgeous. And if I can say with complete political correctness, as art thou. So you're completely beautiful. I just want to just for the sake of sacred delight and integrity, let me just add a last thing and pass back to Andrew. And thank you, which is unique self cannot dissolve at the human level. And one of them is there's two sorts of epistemic mistakes that live in the space. And I would say it in one sentence, right? The relationship between matter, the inanimate world, or the ostensibly inanimate world, I think there's actually sentience all the way down, but the ostensibly inanimate world and the life worlds, right? The biosphere, and then, right, the Chardin's noosphere, the depths of human self-reflective mind, right? Between those three, there's both, and this is a key sentence that Zach and I are writing a lot these days, right? There's both continuity and discontinuity. That's very important. So there's a whole field of people who overemphasize the discontinuity. That's been classical Western thought since Descartes. Descartes thought that animals, no reason not to be cruel to them. So there's this radical discontinuity between the animal and the human. And then there's people who overemphasize continuity. So like my friend Sean Hargens, right, is kind of, and he's a beautiful guy, and I completely agree with him on 1,000 things, but he's in a recent talk he gave just wildly, I think, overemphasized the continuity, right, between what culture means, for example, in an animal world, and what culture means in a human world, right? There's an overemphasis on continuity because there are three big bangs, right? And the three big bangs are, right, the world of matter. Then there's another big bang, the world of life. And there's another big bang, which is culture, which is, right, humanity emerges. And uniqueness is a plot line of cosmos. And in Return to Eros, we talk about the 5 plot lines of cosmos, and uniqueness evolves. So, you know, a cuttlefish is having one experience and Madeline's having another experience, and there's a shared space in those experiences. So Whitehead talks about prehension even at the atomic level, but there's also an enormous distinction, right? The experience of uniqueness at the human level, right, dances dialectically with true self, but never dissolves, and nor should it, right? But it's not separateness, it's uniqueness. So yes, thank you for that. Just with your permission, that distinction. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Okay. Let's remove the spotlight and just see everybody. And I think maybe there's no more people putting their hands up. That might be. We could end on the cuttlefish because an event here is not full until Madalena mentions the cuttlefish.
So be it.
And I also want to say that normally we have every Sunday night we have a reading group here, and I've put people who signed up for this event on the reading list, so you might get a message from me. I hope that is not intrusive. But anyway, everybody is welcome to come and hang out with me on Sunday night and read text together, which is all we do really. And then I have occasional guests. And so Marc, this has been absolutely fantastic, wonderful. I'm looking forward to listening to it again and to capturing all the nuances, an expression that's both highly thoughtful and also emotional or feeling. So I think you're exemplifying what you speak about, and I love to have you have more conversations with you and with Zach and with Alexander and with all the people that we have conversations with here. So
yes,
in the future that will be
Andrew.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you. You were a complete delight, right? In every way, both in the inquiry and in the graciousness and in the depth of the conversation. It's a great start. So thank you very, very much for hosting me in your home. And I look forward to the next step, sir.